All right, let's turn from Genesis to Exodus and move into the second part of the Torah. Just a few introductory matters again. The title of the Hebrew text is "And These Are the Names." That's how the book begins. It begins with the naming, once again, of the patriarchs, the 12 sons, with Joseph already being in Egypt. But these are the sons of Jacob who come, Reuben through Asher, verses 2 through 4. And so this ties back to Genesis chapter 46, when Israel and his family entered into Egypt. Now the Septuagint takes the most significant event, and of course that is the exit, the departure from Egypt. And of course that's how we know it, although do understand really that by the end or partway through chapter 15, the narrative of the Exodus is complete. That the departure is always looked as something that took place in the past, once Israel is out of Egypt. So all of the book of Exodus is not about the Exodus, only about the first third. And then we start to see the consequence of that Exodus, but that is going to continue on without a break into the book we call Leviticus and on into Numbers. The date of the events themselves, it begins from Jacob's entrance into Egypt. This is where it begins. The household, the men who came, the households who came with Jacob. And we've already seen approximately 1876 BC, all the way the building of the tabernacle, which is completed in the second year. So a year after the Exodus, the tabernacle is completed. And so if the Exodus takes place in 1446 BC, then the tabernacle is completed in 1445 BC. Now, as we go through Exodus, this continues on in Leviticus and Numbers, we see at the very beginning where the author telescopes approximately 300 years of history in the first chapter, coming to the birth of Moses, which happened in 1526 BC. Concentrates upon the events of the birth and then basically skips ahead to the 40th year and a major event in Moses' life, and then skips ahead another 40 years to a really major event in Moses' life in chapter 3 and 4, where he is called by the Lord at the burning bush. And then Moses returns to Egypt, and basically chapters 5 through 15 with the Song of Celebration take place in about a calendar year, and then a couple of months to get to Sinai, and then 11 months at Sinai beginning in Exodus chapter 19. That is all going to go all the way to Numbers chapter 10. So we can really see the narrative as far as chronology is concerned slowing down, just hitting high points of 300 years, and then as we've seen, these three high points in Moses' life, birth, 40 years, 80 years, and then really slows down to that year in Egypt, and then moves into 2 months, and they're at Sinai, and then the narrative really slows down. Once again, we need to realize that everything might not be in, outside of these blocks, strict chronological sequence. And we've already seen that in Genesis. but every event did take place at the place and with the exact circumstances that are stated within the text. Again, we are dealing through the first 18 chapters of Exodus predominantly with historical narrative. Then, of course, it's going to change to didactic material as God speaks at Sinai to Israel, and we're going to have a record of what was passed on by Yahweh, first in the oral hearing of Israel, chapter 20, and then what they received through Moses. And again, that's going to continue on all the way through to Numbers chapter 10. As far as the history of interpretation, you can take a look at the third volume of ancient commentary on Christian scripture. And do remember that goes all the way through Deuteronomy. And then a book, because it's part of his exegetical process by Brevard Childs, that on every section of Exodus, what he does is, after giving the historical critical and his understanding, because he's what's called a canonical exegete, that he will take a look at how this has been understood historically, particularly within the Christian church. So I don't want to list all the pages, just go to section 5 of every discussion of every passage, and not only does he deal with the way Exodus has been understood historically, but he will literally go through every passage and give you insight into how it has been understood historically. So these are a couple of resources that you can use to delve into the history of the interpretation of those who come before us on this portion of Scripture. Well, what are the major themes of this portion of the Torah? And of course, the tradition, Septuagintal tradition, has already pointed out in its title a very major theme, and that is the theme of redemption or deliverance or departure, exiting. And this is certainly the key event that is in this portion of the Torah. And in fact, it becomes a very key event in Israel's history to this point. And significantly, the rest of the Torah will look back to the event of the Exodus. And even the former and particularly the latter prophets will look back to this event of the Exodus. That the Exodus is going to be a great event that the Scripture is going to continue to remind Israel generation by generation. Remember what God did to the Egyptians. Remember how God brought you out of Egypt with a strong hand. And it is significant that it is with this event that we have the introduction to so much of the theological language that is going to be picked up even in the New Testament. That this event is viewed as a redemption. You can take a look at chapter 6, verse 6. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. Right? Because they had been allowed to go to Egypt and then ultimately enslaved, coming under bondage in Egypt, just as predicted in Genesis chapter 15, that in this exiting from Egypt, it's almost like a purchase price has to be paid. Now, there is no price. It just says the redemption is with outstretched arm and great judgments. It is what God does. It's God's activity. It's God's deeds. It's the price, you might say, that God pays for this deliverance to occur. And so I will redeem you. God has to work. God has to act. We might put it this way, it costs God some activity for this to take place. It's interesting, this anticipates the Exodus, chapter 15, verse 13, and the song of victory composed by Moses. The events are looked back and viewed as a redemption. So we have redeem and numbers of terms for deliverance, to rescue, to save, to deliver by providing help, to go out. That is to leave one place, go out toward another. And the Lord can look back on the fact that He brought them up. They went out because He brought them out. He brought them up out of Egypt to Himself. And I said these are roots that are going to be picked up, by particularly the latter prophets as they look and see what God did in delivering, saving, bringing out, redeeming His people in the past, and how that then becomes language they will use to anticipate what God is going to do for His people in the future. In both a physical sense, as what took place in the Exodus event, but also looking to, ultimately, to the fact that this also pictures something spiritually, where God is going to bring His people from a spiritual bondage to spiritual freedom, and speak about that too as redemption, as salvation, as deliverance, as a bringing out and a bringing in. So these first 14 and a half chapters of Exodus play a vital role in the Old Testament canon, and obviously mean that you should pay very close attention to the events and the way they are narrated, because they, as I say, become indicative not only of what God did in the past, but what God is going to do in the future. So, the past. What does He do? Well, that is what we're going to look at as we go through the passages. But certainly, as we come to Exodus, there is a tremendous emphasis in the book on the name of the Lord. The name of the Lord. And significantly, there's an intensification of the use of the name Yahweh. And there it is in the notes. In fact, it is in this narrative where the very meaning of Yahweh is revealed. Voltaire's little booklet on the revelation of the divine name, which is well worth reading. And I list for you there, we have the emphasis upon the name of Yahweh, and then how Israel came to know Yahweh, the knowledge of Yahweh. And even as we go through the book, that how Yahweh's name, because of what it reveals and the knowledge that is thereby gained, how there is to be a fear, there is to be a reverence that is given to the name of Yahweh because of how it does reveal Israel's God. By the way, 398 times Yahweh is mentioned in this section of the Torah that we call Exodus. Well, let's look, very quickly at this revelation of the divine name. It's given in chapter 3 of Exodus. Now, it is significant that Moses receives this revelation, and at this point he is acquainted with the God of the fathers, but when verse 13, Moses said to God, and I want to interestingly bring that up, that throughout this passage, it is interesting that it is God communicating to Moses and Moses communicating to God. Now we know this, Yahweh, this appearing to him through his messenger, 3:2. But verse 4, when Yahweh saw he turned aside to look, God called to him and said. And so verse 11, Moses said to God. Now the God who's communicating to Moses is Yahweh. Even identifies himself as the God of the fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And here we see the fear of God. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Now Yahweh speaks because he talks about, obviously, his covenantal faithfulness. But through everything that Moses hears, he doesn't hear Yahweh. Moses said to God. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? And he said, that is, God said, certainly I will be with you. And then verse 13, and Moses said to God. Notice Moses is not yet identifying God as Yahweh. Behold, I am going to the sons of Israel, and I shall say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now they may say to me, what is his name? See, in the ancient world, in the ancient Near East, if you did not have a name, you did not exist. If you existed, you would have a name. And as we've already seen, that name was not only to state your existence, but was also to communicate something about who you were, something about your character, your attributes. So when he says, look, if I say, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, they're going to say, well, if God of the patriarchs, God of the fathers has appeared to you, then what's his name? If you don't know his name, then he really hasn't appeared to you. Because you must know his name for you to have an experience with him, because he really, how do we know he exists unless you know his name? And second of all, that name tells us something about who he is. So they may say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, all right, if you want the lengthy name, here is this. I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Now, obviously, this is the verb to be. And you can see here, does it mean, I am? Or does it mean I cause to be? Or even I control probably best to see it just as going back to the verb to be itself, as is translated in all of the major versions, even picking that up in the Greek as the Septuagint translated it. They're just basically saying, I am. Now, when can Yahweh say, I am? All the time. When Yahweh fellowshiped with Adam in the garden, he was, I am. When Yahweh called both Noah and Abram and entered the covenant with him, he was, I am. Now he's speaking to Moses. He is, I am. Now you see what this therefore is stating is the fact that no matter where you look in history, and of course Israel's hearing this, they're hearing from Genesis 1 all the way, well, actually Genesis 2 when Yahweh is first used in the garden account, fellowshipping with Adam. All right, and so I am. All right, he was I am in Genesis 2 all the way through Exodus chapter 3, and of course he continues. Now a second generation of Israel as they're on the plains of Moab. I am is speaking to them. And of course they get the idea that I am is speaking about his eternality, the fact that he is not bound by time. Now because he's not bound by time, because he is, no matter when he speaks, I am has sent me to you. Since he is eternal, now here's something that becomes very, very vital. He is a God who can speak to Adam, a God who can speak to Noah, a God who can speak to Abraham. And even though what he speaks is not necessarily completely experienced in their generation, he is a self-existent, eternal one. He is the I am who can speak in one generation and act in the future. And so implied with his name is not only the fact that he is the eternal, self-existent one, that is, no matter where in history he's always existed. He is the great I am. So self-existent, eternal, but also because of that character, he can also be a faithful God. He can make promises. He can even give covenant oaths and remember them. In fact, this very narrative is in response to what you read at the end of Exodus chapter 2. Israel sighed because of their bondage, verse 23. They cried out, their cry for help because of their bondage rose to God. God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel, and God knew them. God remembered. God knew. God was intimate with what was taking place. And they're in bondage. They're crying out. And he remembers his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Why? Because he was there when he made it. And when he made it, he said in Genesis chapter 15, they'll be in bondage, but I'm going to do what? I'm going to bring my judgment upon that people, and they are going to be released and come back to this land. Now, because he is the eternal, self-existent I am, he can remember the promises that he has made, validated by covenant oath, and he can start to act in this generation to fulfill a promise he had made in previous generations. You see, he has to be eternal. He has to be the continual I am to be able to act in this way, and he will. And God furthermore said to Moses, verse 15 of chapter 3, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, Yahweh. Now, taking the third commandment literally, the Masoretes give no vocal vowel pointing for the consonants, so we don't know exactly how this name was pronounced. We believe it was Yahweh, that basically we believe means he is. I am becomes, when you talk about him, he is. So he is the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This will be my name forever. This is my memorial name to all generations. This is the name now by which I am to be known by Israel. So gather the elders, say to them, Yahweh, the God of your fathers. He is the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I am indeed concerned about you and what has been done to you, etc., etc. And so then, then we see by chapter 4, verse 10, Moses said to Yahweh. No longer does Moses speak to God, though he is God, he is the powerful one, he is Elohim, he is the creator, he is the one that can reveal himself in this bush which is burning and yet consumed. He can show himself sovereign over nature in this very revelation, but this one who is sovereign, creator, sovereign over all things, for Israel is the great I am. He is Yahweh. He is. And after this point, that is the special name by which is to be called by the Israelites. Yahweh is your God. And by this, obviously, becomes their testimony, through the rest of their history, that Yahweh becomes their God. Yahweh is their God because Yahweh has revealed himself to them. So here is the name and here its meaning. Here is what it means. And we already see that Moses fears God. Even before that, the ladies, the midwives, they feared God as well. But now Israel is to learn to fear Yahweh. By the way, why the plague? So that Pharaoh might learn to fear Yahweh. And of course, as Israel experienced the first two of the plagues and saw what Yahweh did to Egypt, this was all for them to learn to fear Yahweh as well. But what is vital is that Israel not only know the name of God, but also come to experience that name. And how do they experience that name? They experience that name through the Exodus, by God being faithful to the promise that he had made to Abraham. Go over to chapter 6. This is where God needs to give encouragement to Moses. They're very discouraged. I showed up, I told Pharaoh, let my people go. He wouldn't let them go, puts more work on them. Now the people are mad at me. Don't worry, Moses, what I promised is going to take place. And then verses 2 through 9, God goes further. Speaking to Moses and said, I am Yahweh. And I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob as God Almighty, El Shaddai. But my name, Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. Through Yahweh, they did not know, they didn't experience, they were not intimate with the meaning of that name. Well, they knew me as El Shaddai. Well, wait a minute, they also knew the name Yahweh. Go back to chapter 15, verse 2. Abram said, O Lord God, O Adonai Yahweh, O Master Yahweh, what will you give me? He knew the name Yahweh. Yahweh revealed himself to him. Yahweh revealed himself implied by name, so that Abraham can speak with Yahweh by name. Yahweh, what are you going to do? So it doesn't mean know in just a sense of intellectual apprehension. The patriarchs knew the name Yahweh, but they had not experienced the meaning of that name. Now, they also knew God as El Shaddai, God of the mountain, God of all power. Had they experienced that about God? And the answer is yes. Hey, having a baby at 100 to a woman of 90, not normal, even in that day. That's El Shaddai. They'd experienced him as El Shaddai, as the powerful God. What they had not experienced is the fact that he had made promises to them that generations later he would fulfill. And that way they would experience the name Yahweh. As Yahweh, I established my covenant with them, verse 4 of chapter 6, to give them the land of Canaan. And furthermore, I've heard the groaning of the sons of Israel. And to chapter 2. Say therefore to the sons of Israel, I am Yahweh, verse 6, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from their bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. Then I will take you from my people. I will be your God, and you shall know that I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and will give it to you for a possession. I am Yahweh. How is Israel going to experience the name Yahweh? Through the Exodus and also the conquest. Being delivered from bondage and being brought to the land that I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, gentlemen, let's just go back, just so you remember, go back to chapter 15 of Genesis. Genesis 15, here is the promise that Yahweh made. Notice it says Elohim made it, but on verse 18, Yahweh made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your seed I've given this land. So Yahweh, the eternal, self-existent, I am, makes his promise, walks through the animals, covenant oath, binds himself to fulfill the promise. And what is the promise? Well, your seed, verse 13, will be strangers in a land not theirs, where they'll be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. I will also judge the nation. As for you, go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall return here to this land. The land he pledges, verses 18 through 21. And when the sun had set, verse 17, there appeared that smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed through these pieces, Yahweh validating what he said would come to pass by covenant oath. Did Abraham experience that deliverance and that reception of the land? No. Nor did Isaac, nor did Jacob, nor did his 12 sons. Nor has any generation leading up to this point, but now it is in the process of taking place. And this is the means by which Israel will come to experience the reality of the name Yahweh. Yahweh is the eternal, self-existent I am, or Yahweh, He is. And they will experience that He is who could speak in the past and now bring it into our experience. We'll experience what that name Yahweh means. And you see from Exodus chapter 15 on, Israel has no excuse for not knowing Yahweh. Interesting, even going back to chapter 5, verse 2. Pharaoh responds to Moses by saying, "Who is Yahweh that I should obey his voice to let Israel go?" Who is Yahweh? Guess what the 10 plagues were, gentlemen? A theology lesson. You want to know who Yahweh is? He is the eternal, self-existent, covenant-keeping God. And you're going to experience that because you will come to know Yahweh is the one who delivers His people. So who's Yahweh? Yeah. By the end of chapter 14, Pharaoh knew who Yahweh was very well indeed. By the way, he was intimate with him in one sense, but he was not intimate with him in another sense. He experienced Yahweh's faithfulness to Israel, and he experienced, because of that faithfulness, judgment upon he and his people. But he did not come to have a living relationship with Yahweh because He didn't bless him. He didn't take him as his God. He cast out his people. Which is a reminder that one can know about Yahweh without knowing Yahweh. Great reminder for Israel. It's sad to say, during Israel's history, they too, like Pharaoh, many times experienced Yahweh. They knew Yahweh, but it was not knowledge about Yahweh and not knowledge of Yahweh. They become just like the nations. Prophets are going to bring that up as well. So here is Yahweh, and of course, even in Exodus, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to Leviticus. But already Yahweh is revealing himself as holy, as set apart. It's interesting, it begins again at the burning bush. 3:5, don't come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you're standing is holy ground, set apart ground. This is unique ground. It's different ground. It's not common. And therefore you can't come as you come to any other plot of ground. And so God is going to be revealed as holy. And of course we'll come back in the next section and talk about the fact that a holy God desires a holy people. And then certainly the theme of the patriarchs, God is acting in accordance with the promise that he has made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And again, beginning in chapter 2, verse 24, we've already looked at, read again in chapter 6, verse 3, verse 8. Going to come back to it. chapter 32, 33, that this God who acts is the God of the patriarchs, the same God who revealed himself to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And certainly there's going to be echoes of the covenants, and I'm going to come back to this in our next segment. Certainly we have heard of the Abrahamic covenant. We have seen what he said he was going to do. In chapter 6 goes back to what he promised to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. But that just becomes foundational to another covenant. A covenant is called the Sinaitic Covenant because of where it was made. Sometimes referred to as the Mosaic Covenant because of the human mediator. But another name that could be given to it is the covenant with Israel. We call the covenant God made with Noah and his sons the Noahic covenant. The covenant that God made with Abraham and his seed, the Abrahamic covenant. So why shouldn't we call the covenant that God made with Israel the Israelite covenant? And the answer is because no one uses that term. But at times we will use that term. This is the covenant with Israel. And the covenant with Israel as a nation, as a people, number one. Because in the future he's going to make another covenant with Israel, which is going to be covenant number 2 with the house of Israel, the house of Jacob. But that's to be found in the future. So that's why we call it number 1, because there's going to be a number 2. There's no second covenant with Abraham. There's no second covenant with Noah. There's going to be no second covenant with David. But there will be a second covenant with Israel. In fact, a covenant is going to replace this covenant. To be continued. That's why we call it covenant number 1. But more predominantly known as the Mosaic or Sinaitic covenant. Just a couple of more. The Sabbath, the principle of the seventh being set apart. So we've already seen the theme of holiness, and even before the Sabbath commandment was given, chapter 16, God was already training Israel to be Sabbath keepers. They weren't in Egypt. They worked every day. They didn't know what it was to take a day off for rest. So Yahweh trained them by the giving of the manna. Every day they would go out and gather the manna. For 6 days they worked, but on the 6th day they got a double portion. Because on the 7th there wasn't any manna. And the interesting thing is on the 7th day, even having getting the double portions, when the Israelites went out to get manna and there wasn't any there. That trained them pretty quickly that on the 7th day you don't go out. So God trained them to be Sabbath keepers before he actually gave the commandment to keep the Sabbath. And of course that's the 4th commandment. Interestingly, in chapter 31, the Sabbath is the sign of this covenant. So in chapter 31, verses 12 to 17, he talks about 6 days work may be done, but on the 7th day there's a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. And verse 17, this Sabbath day is a sign between me and the sons of Israel forever, or unto the ages. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, but on the 7th day he ceased and was refreshed. So the Sabbath is the sign of the covenant. And even when constructing the tabernacle, every 7th day they were to rest. Even something as important as the making of the tabernacle still, you rest on the Sabbath. Passover and unleavened bread. The historical record is given in chapter 12, 13, and then the reminder that these are days, and just given in chapter 12, 13, that this is to be kept then annually by Israel. And that is picked up, and of course the Passover reminds Israel of the Exodus, and so therefore becomes one of the great remembrances for the nation. Quickly, the Decalogue, which is the 10 words. We'll just say this at this point, that there has been some discussion on exactly what those 10 words are. By the way, it's not 10 commandments. A Decalogue is 10 words. We get the idea of the commandments from the form in which they're given. You shall not. But it's interesting, there's 10 words. What exactly are they? And notice that the Jewish order is to make the statement, I'm Yahweh your God, is the first commandment. You say, well, that's not a commandment. Well, but remember, it's 10 words. And then they unite no other gods and no images as being the second commandment. The first commandment is the first word, I shouldn't say commandment. The first word is, I'm Yahweh your God. That gives the focus for the rest of the words. Now, I would lean away from that because obviously these 10 words are words that Israel is called to obey, to listen to hearken to. As we go through this and picked up in the speech of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 5, which seems to say that first statement is not a commandment. It is a word. Now, because the Jews combine what we call commandment 1 and 2 into one command, the Roman Catholic and Lutheran tradition does the same. So how are they going to get 10 words? Because they don't see this as a first word. They see this, the first 2 commandments, as being the first word. Well, they get it by saying that there's 2 areas of coveting. But again, we'll take a look at Exodus, and when you read Exodus and Deuteronomy, you'll see that there is no distinction between the fact that coveting or having this desire for neighbor's house as well as neighbor's belongings, particularly his neighbor's wife. And so all covet under no coveting. So I think the best understanding is the classic Reformed position, which is to see the 10 words as these 10 requirements that God gives in the form of commands. And now that gives hopefully some background to the commandments that you've always believed were these commandments anyway. And then the tabernacle, the place where God meets man. And we'll talk a little bit more about the tabernacle when we get to Leviticus. And then notice that already the wilderness has a very important role to play. It's the wilderness where God meets Moses. It's from the wilderness that God sends Moses to Egypt. It's from out of Egypt that Israel enters into the wilderness, and the wilderness where they will be until they get to the plains of Moab. So the wilderness motif, the wilderness theme, also begins in Exodus as well. We so much associate that with Numbers, we forget that it's already the wilderness from Exodus chapter 15 on.